The smell came first. Not the river smell, which is snowmelt cold and mineral and clean. The specific freshness of water that has not been warm since February. Not the Douglas fir and the wet rock smell of the canyon walls, which I have known since I was 19 years old and which I can still pull up from memory as clearly as a face. The smell that stopped me on the trail above the Selway that June morning was none of those things. It was dense and animal and wrong in the precise way that a smell is wrong when it does not belong to the catalog of things that live in a place. I have spent 30 years guiding backcountry trips in the Selway-Bitterroot, and I know every smell that country produces in every season. I stood on the trail with Matteo 6 feet behind me, and I held up my fist, which is the signal for stop, and he stopped. And I stood there in the quiet and understood before I saw anything that something had changed about the morning. Matteo is my nephew. He is my brother Ado's son. And my relationship with Ado has been complicated for most of my adult life in ways that I am not going to explain in detail, because they are not the point of this account. The point is that Matteo was 14 years old and on the Selway Trail for the first time, and he had come on this trip because Ado had called me in April, which he almost never does, and had asked if I would take the boy into the backcountry for a week. He said Matteo needed it. I said I would think about it, which is what I say when I mean yes but am not ready to say yes. I called back in a week and said yes. I have never explained my life to anyone who asked about it in a way that satisfied them. I have mostly stopped trying. What I can tell you is that I am a person who functions well alone and who has built a life around that functioning, and that having a 14-year-old in my care for 5 days in the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness, no cell coverage from the trailhead in, no road access for the middle 3 days, nothing between us and the nearest help but the river trail in my judgment, was not something I took lightly. Matteo was a good kid, physically capable, better than I had expected, sensible on the trail. He asked good questions and he did not complain about the weight of his pack, and he was willing to be quiet when quiet was called for, which is rarer than people think. I had been glad I said yes. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened on day 3. The Selway in June runs fast. The snowmelt comes off the Bitterroots in a long sustained push through May and June. And the river is cold enough to be dangerous and loud enough to affect how you read the surroundings. The ambient roar of it fills the canyon and changes your acoustic picture, which is something you account for in bear country. You cannot hear as far as you normally can. You compensate by watching more carefully, by reading the behavior of the other animals, by paying attention to the birds and the way the trail changes ahead of you. The birds had been wrong since early morning, not absent. Birds in the Selway in June are constant, varied. The canyon wren and the dipper and the osprey working the river. Wrong in the sense of displacement, concentrated in the upper canopy and on the far bank, which is an avian reaction to ground-level pressure. I had noted it without flagging it to Matteo because I did not want to alarm him over something that might be a bear moving through. The smell changed that calculus. I said quietly over my shoulder, "Stay right where you are." He said, "What is it?" I said, "I do not know yet. Stay." I heard the first Dogman before I saw it. The sound came from the slope above the trail. The canyon wall there is steep, Douglas fir and bare rock alternating. And the trail cuts along the river maybe 50 feet above the water line. The sound was a single exhalation. Not a grunt, not a growl. An exhalation, the way a large animal breathes out when it has been still for a while and has decided to move. Too large, too close. The sound of something that had been on that slope already watching the trail and had now made a decision. I had my bear spray out before the sound finished. 30 years of Selway-Bitterroot bear work, and the hand goes for the spray before the brain catches up, which is the right reflex and the only thing I did correctly in the next 30 seconds. The beast came off the slope at the bend in the trail, maybe 25 yards ahead. Not running. Moving at a deliberate pace that I would describe as an assessment pace, the way a large predator moves when it has seen you and is deciding what category you are. It was in the trail. Fully in the trail, occupying the width of it, and my first cognitive error was the half-second I spent trying to make it a bear. It was not a bear. Too tall at the shoulder, wrong head, the gait completely wrong. Bears on all fours have a specific rolling shoulder action that any backcountry guide can identify at distance. This was not that. The head was up. The eyes were forward. It was moving toward us on two legs. No. Wait. It dropped to something closer to four limbs as it came around the bend, a loping, knuckle-heavy gait that ate ground fast. Not quadruped exactly. Not biped. Something between, something functional. Something that covered the trail distance with an efficiency that closed the gap from 25 yards to 15 in the time it took me to get my thumb on the safety clip of the spray. 15 yards is the outer edge of bear spray effectiveness. I know this precisely. The effective range of the canisters I carry is rated to 30 feet in ideal conditions. Still air, direct deployment. The canyon has a downstream wind at that point in the morning, which is the wrong direction. I had at most a marginal deployment window. I stepped back to Matteo. Not backward, sideways. I moved left to put myself between him and the trail, and I said, without looking at him, "Get against the canyon wall." He did it without asking why. That is the thing about Matteo that I have thought about many times since. He read the situation from my voice, and he moved, and he put his back against the rock face, and he did not speak again until it was over. The Dogman stopped. 15 yards. It stood in the trail and it looked at us. I have described bears to paying clients for 3 decades. The moment of assessment, when a bear has located you and is running its decision process, has a specific quality that experienced backcountry people know. The animal is present in the encounter in a way that is different from being present in the landscape. It is attending to you specifically. The upright canine on the Selway Trail at 15 yards was doing that. It was attending to me in a way that was, I keep reaching for words and not finding the right ones, experienced. Not panicked, not aggressive, not territorial in the explosive way of a bear defending cubs. Patient in a way that suggested it had done something like this before and had a protocol for it. It was the protocol that saved us, I think. The creature's protocol, not mine. Here is what I mean. A bear in a charge is committed. The decision is made and the bear executes it. What I was watching at 15 yards was not a committed charge. It was an assessment that had paused. The cryptid was holding its ground and watching us the way something watches when it is waiting for more information. And that pause was the window I had. I said to Matteo, still without looking at him, "There are more." I heard him make a sound that was not a word. I said, "Listen for them on the upslope." I had heard the second one 30 seconds earlier and had not named it aloud until that moment. A displacement sound from the first stand above us, the sound of weight shifting on the slope maybe 40 yards up. Then a third, further along the trail ahead between us and the river bend. Not sounds that I could identify as specific animals with specific positions, but sounds that told me the trail ahead was not clear and the slope above us was not empty and the animal 15 yards away was not alone. CM4. That is what I understand now. The animal in the trail was the uncertain one, the one whose behavior was hesitant compared to what I would expect from a pack working a coordinated intercept. It had come down the slope too early and too direct, which is not the behavior of a confident animal. The others were holding position. Whether that was because of a hierarchy I was not reading correctly or because the lead animal's behavior had disrupted a planned approach, I cannot say. What I know is that the animal in the trail was the one I could see, and that the others were waiting, and that the waiting was the condition I had to work with. I had the spray up, and I held it, and I did not deploy. The reason I did not deploy is something I have thought about many times, and I stand by it, though I understand why it sounds wrong. Bear spray in a canyon with a downstream wind at 15 yards against a target that had not committed to a charge would have produced a cloud that blew laterally across the trail without reaching the animal, alerted the others on the slope to our exact position, and left me with a depleted canister and no margin for the next 30 seconds. I held the spray and I watched it, and I said to Matteo, "Do not move." He did not move. I want to tell you something about Matteo in that moment. He was 14 years old, and he had his back against a canyon wall on a remote wilderness trail in Idaho with his uncle in front of him, and something he could not see or fully understand on the slope above him and in the trail ahead. And he did not panic. He controlled his breathing. I could hear him doing it deliberately. The slow, conscious in and out of a person who has understood that control is what the moment requires and has decided to provide it. I do not know where a 14-year-old gets that from. I thought about it afterward for a long time. I thought about calling Edo to tell him. I have not called Edo. That is the SP2 thread. Not evidence destroyed, I will get to that, but the call I have not made that I should have made. Edo does not know the details of what happened on the Selway. He knows we had an eventful trip. He does not know his son stood with his back against a rock face and controlled his breathing while a pack of dogmen held a position around us on a remote canyon trail. I have not told him because telling him requires saying the word, and the word requires the whole account, and the whole account requires me to be in a room with my brother saying something that I expect will end with him not believing me. And I have enough distance with Edo already. The animal in the trail held its position for what I estimate was 4 minutes. I clocked it against my breathing rate, 4 minutes of static assessment at 15 yards, during which I did not move. And Matteo did not move, and the sounds on the slope above remained present but not closing. Then it turned. Not away from us, at an angle 45 degrees toward the river, which put the trail ahead of us in its line of movement and cleared the central trail position. It took 3 strides in that direction and stopped again, and this time it looked back. I do not know what to do with what I am about to tell you. But I am going to tell you because leaving it out is a form of dishonesty I am not willing to commit. It looked back, and it looked at Matteo, not at me. At Matteo, specifically past me, at the boy against the canyon wall, for maybe 3 seconds. Then it moved to the riverbank and went into the water, and the trail was empty. The sounds on the slope above us withdrew over the following 8 minutes. I counted the time. The birds came back to the lower canopy on our side of the river first, which is how I knew the slope had cleared. The avian behavior reset. The canyon wren resumed its descent from the top of the wall, and the ambient sound of the trail rebuilt itself around us the way a room fills back in after something has passed through it. When I was certain the trail was clear, I said to Matteo, "We are going to walk back to last night's camp, and we are going to do it at a normal pace." He came off the wall. He did not ask questions. We walked back the 2 miles to camp, and I made coffee on the stove, and he sat across from me, and after a while he said, "What was that?" I told him, "I do not know what to call it." He said, "It looked at me." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why did it look at me?" I said, "I do not know. I honestly do not." We did not talk about it again on the trail. We hiked out the following morning, and I drove him back to his father's house in Boise, and he got out of the truck, and he looked at me through the passenger window for a moment before he went inside. Not like he wanted to say something, like he had already said everything he was going to say about it and had decided that was sufficient, which at 14 years old is more composure than most adults I know would manage. I had my phone out when we reached the trailhead on the last day. I was going to photograph the trail junction and the entrance sign and send them to Edo as documentation of the trip. Something I do for clients, a habit. I did not do it. I put the phone back in my pocket without taking the photograph. And I have thought about why since, and the most honest answer is that photographing the entrance sign felt like creating a record of a trip that I had managed well. And I was not sure I had managed it well. I was not sure the outcome was my doing. That is the unearned part. We walked out of the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness because the creature in the trail made a decision, and I do not know what determined that decision, and I was the adult in charge and I did not determine it. That is something I have had to sit with, and I have gotten better at sitting with it, and I have not gotten all the way to comfortable. There is a man named Emeka Dalgard who guides out of a different outfitter in the Selway country. We have known each other for 15 years, traded information about bear activity and trail conditions the way guides do. He called me in September, 2 months after the Selway trip, to tell me he had found a kill site on the North Fork of the river. Unusual consumption pattern, no drag, controlled access. He did not know what to make of it. I told him about June. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "That explains the elk movement I have been seeing on the North Fork since July." I said, "What kind of movement?" He said, "Displacement, not point source, corridor wide, something moving through the drainage that everything else is making room for." I have a colleague, Vikram Ek, who studies large mammal corridor ecology out of a university in Moscow, Idaho, who I have considered calling. He is a rigorous scientist and an honest person, and he would ask the right questions. I have not called him because calling him requires me to describe what I saw, and describing what I saw to a researcher means the description goes somewhere, into notes or a conversation or a file, and I have not decided whether I want the description to go somewhere. Matteo has not described it to anyone as far as I know. I have not described it to Edo. What I know about the Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness is that it is one of the largest roadless areas in the contiguous United States. Over 1.3 million acres of terrain that receives a fraction of the backcountry traffic of comparable wilderness areas because the access is difficult and the commitment required is real. The Nez Perce knew that country for centuries before it was designated wilderness, and the oral traditions of the Nez Perce describe beings in the canyon terrain that the designation papers do not. Linda Godfrey's documentation of the canine humanoid accounts from the American interior, the Michigan Dogman reports going back to 1887, the Ojibwe tradition. All of it describes the same category of animal that I encountered on the Selway River Trail, an animal that the official taxonomy of North American wildlife does not include, and that the wilderness has been accommodating for considerably longer than the wilderness has had a name. I guided trips into the Selway-Bitterroot for 3 seasons after June. I did not encounter the pack again. I kept a more careful watch on the trail above the river in the lower canyon section, and I adjusted my approach timing to mid-morning when the light was better and the wind was typically upstream, and I told my clients to stay close on that stretch. I did not tell them why. Matteo called me in March. 8 months after the Selway trip, first contact since I dropped him in his father's driveway. He said, "I have been thinking about what happened." I said, "I know." He said, "It looked at me specifically, not at you, at me." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why would it do that?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "I think it was deciding something." I said, "I think you are probably right." He said, "What was it deciding?" I said, "I do not know, Matteo. I have thought about it since June and I do not know." He said okay, and then he asked if I would take him back to the Selway next summer. He said he wanted to hike the North Fork section, the section Emeka had described with the elk displacement. I said I would think about it. I have not stopped thinking about it.